Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Performance Management for Successful Teams. I'm Allison Ryder, Senior Project Editor at MIT SMR, and I will be moderating today's session. This event will be recorded, and the recording and slides will be available to all attendees in approximately 3 to 4 business days. We want this session to be valuable for you, so we welcome your questions. To submit them, please enter them at any time in the questions module on your GoToWebinar control panel. You may also submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag MIT SMR event. We'll answer as many questions as time permits. We're also curious how performance management is handled inside your organizations, so we'll be sending out a poll to vote on at the beginning of today's discussion. If you are having any audio or other difficulties, please follow the instructions in the questions module. Our speakers today are Jordan Birnbaum, VP and Chief Behavioral Economist at ADP, and Michael Schrage, MIT SMR Guest Editor. Our thanks go out to McKinsey & Company for their sponsorship of this webinar. Michael, I'll hand things over to you to explain a little bit more about our program today and get started.
Thank you so much, Allison. It's a pleasure to be here, and I too want to thank McKinsey for its sponsorship here, but I really want to thank Jordan Birnbaum for his willingness to present really genuinely interesting behavioral economic-based findings on how organizations in general and teams in particular can use performance management tools to improve and enhance their deliverables. In other words, to attain success. I want to go into greater detail on this shortly. And Jordan has a fascinating background. He's an entrepreneur, has been an entrepreneur as well as an innovator and intrapreneur within ADP. But what I'd like to do first is take what Allison said very, very seriously and do a quick poll here to take the temperature of the attendees and the participants and create a context for the discussion that we're going to have. With apologies to Simon Sinek, what's your why? Why does your organization run performance management reviews? To evaluate predominantly individuals and teams, to drive development of individuals and teams, to drive organizational performance, some sort of combination, or something else. So we'll give this a few moments. It's a good temperature taker here. We'd like to see what the distribution of rationales are, and we'll go, because I think the motive here and the why here is pretty key. Jordan, top line reaction to this kind of question, this kind of concern?
Well, I would say that the first thing I want to say, Michael, is no one told me that I had to be genuinely interesting. So thanks for that last minute pressure. But
yeah.
What I will say is that as we go through our presentation today, I think that one of the goals is for us to reassess what is it that we're trying to accomplish. And as we start to answer those questions, it may help to illuminate what the best strategies to follow might be, depending on what our ultimate end goal is. And so as we go through this today, well, it looks like the majority of people are running performance management for a combination of purposes. And I suppose on some level that is both fortuitous, because that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about, but also maybe not as fortuitous, because that's something that I'm hoping I will be able to convince you is not necessarily the best approach. And as we go, I'm going to share with you one very particular strain of performance management that we developed with a tool called Compass.
Excellent.
But what I'd like to say as we begin is that there is a key takeaway, and I realize it may be counterintuitive for some of you, but this is the point that I will be trying to make over the course of our discussion today. And it is this: if our intention is to drive professional development, then the key to doing so is actually to keep the assessment data confidential to the feedback recipient. And I realize in an era where transparency is lauded and considered to be a very important and, in fact, even moral approach, nonetheless, if development is our goal, then I'm going to argue in favor of confidentiality. And with that, I can begin to tell you a little bit about a product that I helped to develop within ADP called Compass.
I just want to quickly interject here and say, first off, notice how this is directly linked to the 58% number in that poll question. And the other, forgive my doing this to you, Jordan, but this is going to be conversational. The takeaway that you offer, in fact, empirically derives from the Compass program that you're going to describe, correct?
Correct.
So what is Compass? And please give us that narrative that leads us to the counterintuitive, indeed contrarian conclusion that you've begun with.
Absolutely. So Compass, it began as an internal ADP initiative, something that we were doing to enhance our own organizational culture. And it's something that we had such success with that it evolved into an external ADP product. And essentially, Compass is a leadership development solution that is designed to help leaders meet the unique needs of their teams. And as I talk with you about the product, I'll share with you that there are essentially three components of it. An assessment, which I suspect most of us realize at this point is just a fancy word for survey. There are feedback reports, and then ultimately there is an email coaching component that I am looking forward to sharing with you. But before we dive too deeply into how the product works, let's focus a little bit more on the why. What is it that ADP was initially trying to do that started off the Compass project? The goal was seemingly simple. It was to incorporate new perspectives, the perspectives of teams and collaborative networks when considering leadership and development throughout the organization. There was widespread agreement that accounting for more perspectives would be beneficial to our understanding of the organization. And that was the triggering perspective. But as we started to look into various ways that we could accomplish this, we realized that there were some nuanced and kind of under the radar considerations that would have a major impact on our ultimate product design. And the first of those is, well, what exactly were we trying to accomplish? And as we thought about it, we came to realize that there are several different purposes to running assessments. One might be evaluative. And an evaluative assessment, its primary goal is to provide better information and insight to the organization. To help the organization understand performance so that it can use that insight to make better decisions about compensation or promotions or assignments. And certainly this is a crucial function, but a very particular one. A second reason where people might run assessments is to try to drive development. The idea being that if we provide people with external feedback, that they can use that feedback to understand how to be a better boss, a better collaborator, a better contributor. And then as a third possible rationale for assessments, it might be just performance driven, that we're going to run these assessments so that we get insights and motivation to improve our performance. Those are three very different initiatives and outcomes. And we started to see that trying to accomplish all simultaneously might get a little bit tricky. And the first thing that tipped us off to this was a discussion about the data. And when I say the data, I mean the feedback that people are providing about their bosses or their colleagues. And the first question becomes, who gets the data? Do we give the data to HR? Do we give it, so for example, let's focus on leadership. If a team is providing feedback to a leader, do we give that feedback to the leader's leader? Do we give it to HR? Do we give it to the leader, him or herself? And if we make those decisions, what kinds of impacts might that have? Now, in the world of industrial and organizational psychology, there's actually been quite a bit of research here, and there were some insights that we could already point to. And so, for example, one of the things that we know is that when data is shared, so it's shared with HR and the manager's managers, scores tend to become inflated, in fact, by as much as a third of a standard deviation. Why is that? Why might that happen? So let's just put ourselves in the position of providing feedback to our bosses. If we know that our feedback is going to have repercussions for our bosses, unless we really dislike our boss, we may be inclined to be a little bit more positive because we don't want to have a negative impact on our boss's career. And that seems to be a trend that holds true across organizations, across industries, across seniority levels and the like, is that when data is shared, it tends to be more inflated. Now, alternatively, if I knew that my feedback was only going to my boss, I might feel a little bit more comfortable being completely honest because that would not have any kind of repercussions for my boss's career. And in fact, the data backs us up there that scores usually come in about 1/3 of a standard deviation lower. But outside of the data accuracy, there's another really significant point here that ultimately became the deciding factor in how we developed Compass. And that has to do with developmental potential. What happens to a leader's motivation to develop when the data is shared with HR and their boss versus shared only with them? When I get feedback from my team, and I know that that feedback is being shared with HR, very naturally, as a human being, I go into an impression management mode. If the feedback is less than stellar, I want to do whatever I can to discredit it, to make sure that it doesn't hurt my career. If it's good, I want to find ways to use that to strengthen my career. This is not nefarious. This is just human. The problem is that when we get into an impression management mode, just about the last thing we're thinking about is, how do I use this feedback to develop, particularly if it's negative or constructive? Because if I'm receiving constructive feedback, the natural human response is to discredit it, to say,
So
no, that's not really fair.
just to interject, just to clarify and polarize, what you are saying is there's an inherent conflict between energy and thought invested in impression management and professional development.
Exactly right. That the impression management will usually, particularly when it indicates that there's an improvement needed, impression management usually entails discrediting the feedback. And if you're discrediting the feedback, how likely are you to use it to actually drive long-term behavior change?
So last intercession before we move on to the next slide then is, in behavioral economics terms, people overinvest in impression management at the expense of their own personal and professional development.
Correct. In large part, not only are people thinking about the real world consequences, but they're also battling with their own self-image. We all have a self-image that is crucial to our well-being. And when we receive feedback that threatens that self-image, there is a strong psychological inclination to discredit it so that we can continue to maintain the self-image that makes us most comfortable. And so when we started to really unpack these psychological consequences, we realized we had an important decision to make, that if our intention was going to be to drive development, then really the best thing that we could do was remove anxiety, remove the need for impression management. And the best way to do that was to share this feedback only with the feedback recipient, not to share it with their boss, not to share it with HR, just with that one person. And by doing that, we were setting the stage for development to more naturally occur. And then lastly, what I'll just share is that there's a well-known reality in behavioral economics, which is that education alone is insufficient to drive behavior change. And so we realized, again, if our intention was to drive development, it wasn't enough to merely hand people a report and be done with it, that we had to create some kind of ongoing intervention that was actually going to drive behavior change, because habits and behaviors are deeply ingrained, and just being made aware of something one time is not enough to change behavior. So as we went through these various considerations, the conclusion we came to was that if we wanted to run effective interventions, we had to separate them. If we had an initiative that was intended to drive individual development, it was crucial that we found ways to reduce defensiveness and increase the likelihood of people having a positive frame of mind to develop. If we wanted an initiative that was intended to provide organizational insight, then we were going to have to put our time and energy into finding ways to combat bias, to find ways to make sure that the information that the organization was receiving was accurate and objective. And lastly, if our goal was to drive performance, we came to the conclusion that an assessment was not the right way for us to go. Rather, what we found based on the literature is that the biggest contributor to performance is actually employee engagement. And that requires an entirely different set of initiatives to have a positive impact.
I think those are all important. And before we go on to the next thing, I just want to play the role of either the provocateur or the insultant and observe again that we have a 58% perspective that combination is the way to go. And I want to put you on the spot and say, do you believe the majority of the people in that 58% need to revisit the kind of partitioning and separation that you achieved in your Compass initiative?
I would say no and yes. The no is that I don't know.
What a diplomatic answer. Shame on you. Go ahead.
Well, the no is that I don't know that people are saying that they are, in fact, advocating for mixed use, but rather reporting that that's how it is happening at the organization. So I don't know that there's necessarily an endorsement of that inherent in the polling numbers. On the flip side, though, I would certainly agree that one thing that I hope can emerge from our conversation today is that people will begin to rethink the ultimate goals and then take a step back and say, if that is our goal, are we constructing this in the way that will get us there? Or are we doing things that might ultimately be cross purposes? So part of why we spent so much time talking about these different end goals is that in my explanation of the Compass product, it's very important that we understand that Compass is explicitly designed as a development solution. And with that, I will take you through the different pieces of the Compass product and explain to you how it works. So it begins with a leader and their team. And the team will provide feedback through an assessment. They will answer 12 questions like, I feel understood when I speak with my manager, and rank that on a scale of 1 to 5. To what extent do they agree? And then we include one open-ended item. What can your manager do to be more effective for you in the next 6 months? Then we make sure that everyone is aware that their feedback will be anonymous, meaning that they, as the individuals, will not be identified as having provided a particular score or a particular piece of feedback, but also confidential, that it's only going to be shared with their boss and no one more. We're trying to create a very safe space for honesty and reflection without thinking about other consequences. And then lastly, as we'll talk about a little bit later, Compass is intended to be run with great frequency. So in order to keep the content fresh, we've introduced rotating survey items so that if you're filling out an assessment in January and again in April, that we ask you to consider different attributes of leadership. And that was a way that we felt we would keep the product viable and engaging over a long period of time.
Jordan, thank you. This is excellent. Just to prove that we're paying attention to our participants, your assessment synthesis has provoked or evoked a question, and I think it's a fair question to ask you to deal with at this moment. Against what criteria are assessments measured rather than simply reinforcing existing bias? Or as the gentleman or lady puts it, to put it another way, how do you know the assessor is more right than the individual being assessed? So here you're doing a classic assessment. Foreshadow for us how you do bias adjustment in this context.
That is a fabulous question. With regards to that very point, I'm going to say that that is an inherent challenge in all assessments. And what you're going to find out on the next slide is that we lean into that. What's being referenced there is something known as idiosyncratic rater effect, which basically talks about the fact that when we receive feedback, it has as much to do with the person providing the feedback as it does with the person receiving feedback. And therefore, to assume that that feedback is objective and accurate would be a mistake. Now, as it happens, one of the ways to counter that is to collect feedback from several people. And that way you start to get to a broader consensus about what's really happening, which is something that's at play here. But it is still nonetheless a really significant challenge and something that we actually leaned into to turn it from a challenge to an attribute. And that is a perfect segue into the reports. And we provide 3 levels of reports, and I'm going to focus right now on the individual report. So what we've done now, of course, is we've aggregated the scores across the raters to provide individual leaders with a sense of how their team feels that they are doing. But here's where we frame the feedback. We expressly acknowledge that this is not accurate and objective feedback. We talk about the idiosyncratic rater effect, and we talk about the fact that the feedback you're receiving can be thought of more as insights into the inherent needs of your teams as it is an objective reporting on your performance. And in fact, that framing is one of the keys that we found to getting people to embrace the feedback that they were receiving. We're not putting anything forth as a deficiency, as something that the leader is doing wrong or needs to do better. Rather, we're saying if the scores for providing recognition are low, that doesn't mean that you're doing a bad job as a leader. It means that your particular team has particularly high needs for recognition. And therefore, focusing on providing more recognition will likely have a bigger impact on your team than anything else that you can do. And by framing the feedback that way and acknowledging the idiosyncratic rater effect, we've actually created a situation now where leaders are far more excited about embracing this feedback than feeling defensive or rejecting it. Does that make sense, Michael?
It makes sense. I think it's an excellent response to the point. And if I may just underscore a point that you're making, you use the language of framing. And when one looks at Kahneman and Tversky's work in prospect theory and behavioral economics, it's very, very clear that the framing phenomenon is key. So can you spend just a few moments discussing and describing for how you get acceptance on these things, how your research and work in behavioral economics informs the design of these reports and their associated feedback?
Well, thank you for mentioning 2 of my heroes. And I will, in fact, use an example that comes directly out of Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. You go to a doctor. The doctor can say one of the following 2 things to you. You have contracted a disease with a 90% survival rate, or you have contracted a disease with a 10% mortality rate. Those are identical statements factually, but very different statements emotionally. How doctors choose to present that reality to a patient is going to have a huge impact on how people respond, on their optimism, on their recovery plans, on their commitment to recovery plans. And so the point that they're making is that human beings are inherently, quote unquote, irrational, because for us to have a different emotional reaction to identical information that is presented in different ways is not a perfectly logical being. And it is part of what has spawned this entire field of behavioral economics, which looks at how human beings actually behave as opposed to how they ought to behave if governed by perfectly logical, self-interested, rational thinking. So ideas like framing help us understand how we can present information in ways that will make it most likely to be embraced by people by considering things like emotional needs, heuristics, biases, and all sorts of other quirks of the human condition. Now, going back to Compass, just because we keep the individual results confidential to the individual does not mean that there isn't something of value for the organization. And what we've done is aggregate the findings that leaders are receiving from their teams to look at it from a global perspective. So, for example, we might find that for one organization, the most common low score amongst leaders is supporting development, whereas in another organization, the most common low score amongst leaders is providing clear plans to adapt to change. And what we can say here is that while it's not about any one leader in particular, that there may be surfacing organizational culture insights. Perhaps in your organization, there's not enough emphasis on development. Perhaps if there is an initiative that you want to introduce to your organization, development would be a great place to look, given that this is where we see the feedback coming back to the leaders as a whole. And then lastly with Compass, something that we're very proud of is that we have the ability to measure its impact, and that comes across in the impact report. So essentially, we run an assessment, we introduce an intervention, and then we run another assessment. And when we do that, we're able to demonstrate to what effect the intervention that we ran, which I'll be talking about on the next slide, has had an impact. And in the world of leadership development in particular, this has been a really elusive goal. And the fact that we were able to achieve a built-in functionality that shows to what extent the product is working or not is something that we're very proud of. The last component of Compass is the email coaching. Essentially what happens is that when a leader receives their report, they're notified that beginning next week, they will start to receive 8 weekly emails that are going to be focused on the lowest score, which of course we have reframed as the greatest team need. The email coaching itself is an exercise in behavioral economics. I could spend an entire webinar talking about the behavioral economics that is built in to the coaching. I will not do that on this one.
Next time on this, yes.
Exactly. Next time we'll talk about behavioral economics. But just at a high level, there are 2 points that I want to make. And the first is that we don't hit people over the head with, here's what to do on week 1. And we very much follow adult learning theory here, which is that before we start saying, here's how to be better at providing recognition, we start to make the case for why providing recognition is a worthwhile goal, why this is good for you, for your team, for your career, etc. We then start to focus on building empathy so leaders can have a better understanding of how they are affecting the people on their team. And it's only after we've achieved that that we start to provide practical guidance. Here are some things to try that could have a really significant impact. The other point that I want to make for the skeptical out there, and I've encountered many in my days talking about this product, is, well, what if people don't read the emails? And I would say not only is that a possibility, perhaps that's even a likelihood. And the good news is that we have a plan for that, and it's something called priming. And if you see in this graphic where it says week 1, recognition, here's why coach thinks you're cool. We're using the word recognition as a priming technique. Our goal is that even if you don't read the email, you at least see the email subject line. And so for 8 weeks in a row, that word recognition is popping up in your email box, reminding you that recognition is your focus. Our hypothesis was that merely bringing the concept top of mind would be enough to affect positive behavior change. So with all that being said, here's where the rubber meets the road. What actually happened? Well, within ADP, we have run Compass 6 times. We've had more than 80,000 employees participate over the course of about 1.5 years. We've had more than 6,500 managers receive coaching. One of the great things about building products at a place like ADP is that you have a massive testing bed like this. And here's what we found. Well, as we discussed, we measure 12 items at a time, and we only coach 1 of them. So that means for each follow-up assessment, there are 11 uncoached items. And for the uncoached items, the scores did not change, which spoke well to the reliability of the assessment. For the 1 coached item, scores improved by 10%. 10% in a vacuum doesn't seem large. In the world of leadership development, it is gargantuan. As I mentioned, there has been a dirty secret in leadership development that it's impossible to demonstrate return on investment. That we were able to achieve this on our first run out was really something that made us extremely happy. And I will also mention that 10% improvement went across the entire organization, When you went to the leaders that were the lowest in the leadership hierarchy at ADP, the scores actually improved by 14%, demonstrating that there is a greater need for newer, less experienced managers when it comes to development. Now, there are some common why questions that come up when we talk about Compass that I thought I would address now very quickly. Why surveys and not focus groups? Well, first and foremost, scalability. Surveys allow us to do this at a massive level. Whether we're running this for 10 people or 10,000 people, the survey makes it an identical experience. It also facilitates our being able to do this consistently over time. Why only 12 items? Why not 40? And the answer is we don't want to create too much work for people. We don't want this to be something that is groan worthy, and we certainly don't want to create survey fatigue. So we keep the assessments short so that we can run them more frequently. Why quarterly? Well, there's two reasons. One is that organizations have a desire to create more feedback-rich environments, and our feeling was that Compass was a practical way to enable this, to make this a reality, that an organization would become more of a constant feedback organization. But there's also another important point here, and it has to do with something called recency bias. This is a very human quirk. But when you're offering performance management reviews once a year in December, what you're really assessing is someone's performance in November. Whatever has happened most recently is what is most salient in our minds and what is most powerfully affecting our perceptions. And so when you do performance management only once a year, you're not getting an accurate picture of performance over the course of the year. And so our feeling was that going with a quarterly assessment would allow us to overcome the inherent challenges of recency bias. And lastly, I get this question a lot, why not a 360? Why only teams to leaders? Why not the leader getting feedback from peers and from their bosses at the same time? And the answer is because we want them to be able to focus on one thing. The feedback we get from the people who report to us ought to be very different from the feedback that we get from the people to whom we report. And trying to think about both things at once will end up minimizing the impact of either. And so again, we wanted to keep this laser focused on this one area in which people could develop and improve. The email coaching, again, I think I've mentioned most of these things, that just handing off a report would not be enough to drive behavior change. But there's one other important point that I think is worth bringing up here. We had talked about creating a website and asking people to go to the website to drive their own development. But we also came to realize that people would very likely not go. That no matter how good the website might be and no matter how good the content might be, it was going to be very hard to get people to go there. And from our perspective, the ability to push this content to them over the course of a busy day was going to be the real thing that made a difference, that we could push it so that people were experiencing it over the course of their workday instead of having to reserve time and drive their own motivation to go when people are already far too busy. I will say that the email coaching was not without its own challenges. We had to overcome a perception of spam. We had to find the right tone so that people were actually interested in reading the emails and weren't merely eye-roll worthy. And that took a lot of work and a lot of testing, but clearly where we landed had some very positive impacts.
So Jordan, I want to ask you a question before you go into the conclusion based on the personal coaching. And we had casually discussed this, but I want to be explicit about it. You have male leaders, you have female leaders, you have older people, you have younger people. Was the coaching bespoke, personalized, and customized to the individual, or was it a one-size-fits-all?
First time out of the gate, it was a one-size-fits-all, and still is. As we will talk about in a moment, as what's in the future of Compass, that is absolutely a place where we should play. Are there elements, whether they are demographic, whether they are psychographic, so gender, age, can that help predict a better way to construct the coaching to make it more impactful? What about geography? What about industry? What about job class? Should we be talking the same way to managers in an accounting company as we are managers in a professional services company. There are lots of new areas for us to explore about how to make the coaching most impactful. At this point, however, just from a practical standpoint, we already have far too much coaching that needs to be developed. So we're currently at a one-size-fits-all. But your question certainly points to the future of where Compass is heading.
Very good.
Now, what I just wanted to say about Compass, this is a line that I've said many times before. We don't know anything about leadership development that you don't also know. We are all operating from the same playbook and from the same knowledge base. What really differentiated Compass was our application of behavioral economics and psychology. And what that really meant was making good guesses, anticipating how are people going to respond? How are people going to respond unconsciously? What are their incentives to engage? What will make them defensive? What will diminish that defensiveness? What kinds of follow-through can we expect? What kinds of follow-through must we need to drive some real change? And I think that taking a very realistic and human-centric perspective in thinking through these things is a big part of why Compass has succeeded, because we made some very good guesses. And to your question, Michael, because you are a forward thinker, what's next for us is we are going to continue to experiment. We've been experimenting since day one, and so long as I'm there, we will experiment as long as the product exists. Human beings are infinitely complex and constantly evolving, which means that our product should as well. We'll be looking at how often should we run this? What should we be measuring? Should we be changing that based on whether someone is in marketing or in legal? Should we be changing it by industry, by geography? What about the coaching? Should we diminish the length of emails and make them shorter? Should we blow out the emails and start linking to videos and the like? What are other ways that we can drive these interventions? Is it possible that letting people choose how their coaching comes to them will have even more of an impact? So this is the work that's ahead of us, and something that the entire team is really excited about, because not only are we affecting positive change, but we also get these wonderful insights into human nature. Now, before we get through my final thoughts about Compass, I did think that it was worth just taking a little bit of a look at a different challenge, that of evaluative assessments, the assessments that are designed to provide organizations with insights into what's happening, because I realize that a lot of people in our audience, that's actually one of their big challenges and points of emphasis, is to make those more effective. And I thought it would be helpful to take a little bit of a behavioral economics lens to that particular problem, given that we've been spending most of our time focused on development. And there are some inherent challenges that I think that have to be considered by organizations when they're running these performance management sessions, particularly once a year. And the first thing that I think has to be considered are incentives for the managers. So let's think about this experience. At the end of the year, comes December, your direct report sits across from you. If you have positive feedback to give, that's going to be a pretty fun conversation. And when you leave the room, everyone's going to be in a good mood. When you have negative feedback to provide, that's not so comfortable a conversation and not so comfortable a relationship in the aftermath. And in addition to that being a reality that the manager is facing, what about the perceptions of the manager? What happens to their reputation if they become known as somebody who is really hard to work for, really hard to please, someone who is overly critical, versus someone who is seen as providing lots of positive feedback and being really positive? There are really significant unstated incentives for managers to provide glowing reviews. If we expect our managers to be more objective and to be more accurate in the feedback that they're providing, we have to address that issue. We have to find ways to incentivize them to accomplish that, and to be conscious of these influences that could be affecting the feedback that they provide. And then we get to the point that harkens back to the question from our very astute audience member earlier. Well, what is a manager's ability to be objective and accurate? And the answer is not very. We talked about the idiosyncratic rater effect. That's not only true when teams are providing feedback to their leaders, it's equally true when leaders are providing feedback to their teams. The feedback that we provide says as much about us and how we view the world and what our expectations are as it does about the people to whom we're providing feedback. And really, the field of behavioral economics is just one long list of biases and heuristics. Biases are mental tendencies, heuristics are mental shortcuts. There is a very long list of biases and heuristics that occur when human beings are in the process of evaluating others and providing feedback to others. And what the science tells us is that the ability for people to provide objective and accurate feedback is actually virtually impossible. Now, there are lots of strategies and measures that organizations can take in order to overcome this. However, that also requires its own webinar and is far too involved a discussion for us to take on here. But I will say that there's a lot of great literature out there about how to remove bias and heuristics from evaluative assessments.
But it's very important that you presented here this contrast between development as the organizing principle versus evaluation as an organizing principle.
Yeah, I think that was really the hope of our conversation today, Michael, was that that distinction would be clear to people. And with that, in fact, I think it's a perfect time before we take questions to just sort of re-emphasize what were the most important elements that we believe made Compass so successful and what we think it tells us about how to drive development across organizations and for individuals. And the first is that defensiveness is natural. When people receive constructive feedback, we should anticipate that they will feel defensive, and it's incumbent upon us to figure out ways to diminish that, to make it safer, whether that has to do with reframing the feedback or other kinds of exercises that we can engage to diminish defensiveness. It is crucial if we want to drive development. One way that we were able to do it was to acknowledge the idiosyncratic rater effect, to acknowledge and put it out there that human feedback is not objective and accurate, and that it's mixed up with all sorts of different elements. And we all need to be conscious of that when we're evaluating this feedback, because it might provide us with not only less defensiveness, but other important insights. And that's where we came to how we reframed our feedback, is that we found that statements like "your team needs more recognition" is far more positive than "you are poor at providing recognition." And again, I would say that education alone is insufficient if you want to drive development. Just making someone aware of something is not going to drive development. It requires an ongoing focus. And what I would say, to go back to our key takeaway from the first slide, the one thing that supports all of this, that makes all of this more likely and more positive, is keeping the developmental feedback confidential to the feedback recipient. That sole design criteria helps to diminish defensiveness, helps to reframe feedback, and helps to set the stage for what will become a successful ongoing developmental initiative. And with that, I'd like to say, Michael, I am passing the ball back to you, my friend.
Well, you've set things up very, very well, because we've gotten a number of questions and comments. I look forward to getting more, but I'd like to read to you one of the questions that relates directly to this tension, to this conflict that you observe. The question states as follows: we pay for performance at our company. By keeping feedback confidential, how do we allocate bonuses, salary adjustments, etc., if our goal is development and performance enhancement? Or does the goal of performance management have to exclusively be either evaluation, performance, or development? How do you square, so my language, how do you square the circle? Do you have to launch a multiplicity of things? When you've seen how Compass is used, how do you see organizations resolving this tension, this conflict that this question embodies?
It's a fabulous question. My answer is exactly right, is that it requires multiple initiatives. The initiatives that are around development require confidentiality and require this kind of reframing to understand the inherent needs of teams. When it comes to evaluating people to make decisions about promotions and compensation and evaluating their performance, I think that that requires a separate initiative. And those kinds of initiatives, I would probably start talking about the importance of creating shared criteria for evaluation and finding ways to make those as objective as possible. In some regards, the assessment of performance is necessarily subjective. So if subjective is ultimately something that's unavoidable, we can at least talk about in those subjective assessments, what are the things that we're looking for? Make sure that everyone is on the same page about what are the criteria that we are subjectively assessing. I would say that it is crucially important to get feedback from multiple sources with the realization that any one source of feedback and assessment is going to be deeply biased and not necessarily reflective of the actual performance, and that by broadening the sources of data, we have a greater chance to start to overcome those biases. When you're doing things like assessing performance, what you have to realize is that you may have one manager who's very lax and says everybody's doing great, everybody deserves a promotion. And you might have another manager who's very, very hard. And that manager might say that a performer really only was mediocre over the course of the year. But if that person had had a different manager, they would have gotten a very different performance rating. So finding ways to overcome those inherent challenges are crucial for the evaluative assessments to proceed. And I realize that it's a necessary activity. Organizations need them. They need to understand how people are performing. It's not something that we can do away with. My only point is that it requires its own initiative, and trying to bake development into that same initiative just really undermines the effectiveness of both.
So let me ask, before I go to the next question from our participants, our audience, a political point that this raises. And I know that you're a vendor and you're not going to pitch, but you're dealing with these kinds of cultural and organizational conflicts all the time. Are HR organizations the best intermediary, the best champions for managing the approach that you say? Or should the business units be running it themselves? Who should be running these kinds of concurrent efforts to balance evaluation, productivity, assessment?
So I would say that industrial and organizational psychologists should be involved. And the reason for that is because there is a wealth of literature and study around the various factors that influence performance assessments and understands the efficacy of different interventions and innovative interventions that have emerged over time, and understand sort of how to evaluate the effectiveness of those. And they have to operate in partnership with the business units who understand specifically what the realities are on the ground and what matters. So I really think ultimately it comes down to a partnership between some familiarity with industrial and organizational psychology versus the subject matter expertise that's embedded within each business unit. I don't think either can exist on their own, and it requires true collaboration and a true merging of knowledge bases.
So let me ask a question from the audience, or repeat a question from the audience that sort of is at the intersection of that. How do KPIs play their part in performance appraisal based on the Compass tool? How do we link KPIs with developmental purpose? So we're doing basically, how do KPIs deal with that same tension of assessment and performance enhancement and development? How do you, when you've worked with your clients inside ADB and outside, what role do KPIs play as something you link to?
So I would say that there's two answers to that question. And another great question. This is obviously a really informed audience. So KPIs are wonderful tools, particularly in evaluative performances, because they remove subjectivity. They are easy to measure. There is no bias baked into them. Now, for example, with sales, you could look at a salesperson and say, okay, what numbers did you hit this quarter? Now, it may be that we're in the middle of a recession or that the economy is booming, and that could have some kind of impact, but nonetheless, that's going to hold across all the salespeople. And so in that regard, there's no question about, well, how well is this salesperson hitting their numbers? The problem is that KPIs are subject to measurability. And measurability is not necessarily the only thing that indicates someone's value to the company. How can we measure objectively the impact of someone for being a really good teammate, for being a great collaborator, for being supportive? What are the KPIs that can capture that? And if it can't be captured, does that mean that it should be ignored, that it shouldn't be something that's considered in someone's overall performance? There is such a thing as measurement bias, where we tend to put more emphasis on things that are easily measured. The problem is that there are things that are not easily measured that are incredibly important.
But Jordan, let me move on. To your knowledge, do your clients, or is there a group within ADP that really likes to tightly couple assessment to KPIs? To look for those, to explicitly look for correlation, as opposed to development for development's sake?
Yes, so that's the second part of the answer, which is, so that then comes down to data, and part of the ongoing iteration of Compass is doing data analysis to see, when we see these 10% improvements, what are the impacts to these other KPIs? So within ADP, we could find that when sales leaders improved, so did sales. We could find that when customer service leaders improved, so did Net Promoter Score. And you can start to make these correlations to look for those relationships.
So you do the kind of data science, forgive me, principal component analysis work. So you see that, in fact, moving the needle for certain sorts of capabilities or skills does lead to impact on the KPIs.
So this is where it gets very different between ADP internally and ADP externally. So yes, within ADP internally, and I don't know that I'm, within ADP internally, there's a lot of work being done to look at that, not only with our Compass tool, but with all of our tools, as ADP has taken a more aggressive play in the world of talent activation and trying to find ways to get the most out of our teams and our team leaders, to find how making those investments actually is helping to impact the bottom line. At our clients, we don't have access to the same kind of data. And so from our perspective, one of the things that we're trying to build are tools that we could provide them so that they can start to look at how are leadership development improvements affecting their bottom line. But this is an ongoing effort.
Sure.
And,
but this is analogous. But this is analogous to Compass going from an internal tool to an external tool.
Correct.
So one of the questions that I've gotten, and I'm ashamed that I didn't get to it earlier, but it should be in your sweet spot, is Compass focused overwhelmingly on the Western countries, English speaking only, and how do you address cultural factors when you seek to globalize the impact of this tool, or when this tool seeks to serve global, international, multinational, multicultural companies?
It's a fabulous question. So what I can tell you is that Compass ran globally for ADP internally. We are currently exclusively in the US and Canada externally. We have done analysis on ADP across the globe and how they interacted with Compass, and we saw in some countries that it clearly did not have the same level of impact, and other countries where it had a really significant impact. And there are teams that are trying to understand what contributed to that and how did cultural factors play a role? How can we start to anticipate cultural factors to play a role? The answer right now is we don't know yet. And when it comes to our external version, we will probably be focused very much on a country-by-country rollout for specifically that reason, with the understanding that the tone of the emails, how we approach, what we measure may be wildly inappropriate in some countries and wildly productive in others. And so it's going to be a very slow and tedious process to understand.
No, before I go to the other question, I'm gonna challenge that answer. Here I am. I'm a European company or an American company that does a lot of outsourcing to India in software development and customer service. But obviously, how well I manage these outsourcing efforts, and how well my indigenous or local managers relate to the parent or with each other is a big deal. Haven't you had that kind of issue arise?
Well, no, we haven't serviced in those cases. And in fact, there's data privacy issues as you go globally that have to be considered as well. So with our external version, that's why we've stuck exclusively to the US and Canada. So we don't have any external clients.
GDRP is your excuse for not doing that.
Say again?
GDRP is your excuse for not doing that.
I would say that ultimately, no, it's that the complexity of the challenge is the excuse for not doing that, is that it would be, I think, presumptuous for us to know that what we're developing for the US is going to be equally impactful in India, or that we have the expertise to understand what would be most impactful in India. So I think that we're, as a young product, going global is part of our future, but it's going to be a very complex and thoughtful process of doing it for precisely the complications that are being raised from the audience.
So speaking of a complication issue raised from an audience, here's a framing that I'd like you to address. I think, and we have just a couple more minutes to go, I think evaluation is looking back and development is looking forward. A performing organization must make an optimum connect between the two. However, question is how to create this connect and proactively manage it. What insight do you have between this retrospective and prospective balance between assessment and evaluation and development?
Gosh, I think it's a fabulous point and extremely well articulated. I don't necessarily have an answer. I think that that's correct, that evaluations are past-looking and development is forward-looking. I suppose that my answer probably goes back to the original thesis, which is that that's why it's so important to separate the two. I realize that in evaluative assessments, organizations are using the idea that past performance is the best predictor of future performance, and or they're taking the position of we're paying you and compensating you based on how you have performed. So looking backwards is actually appropriate. And when we talk about trying to equip our employee bases to be better in the future, that's very much a developmental issue. So I suppose my answer comes back to the original thesis, which is that that's why it's so important to separate them, because they do move in opposite directions, and therefore they require different inputs and different outputs.
I want to end on a polarizing question with a short answer.
Shocker.
Are you familiar with a Ray Dalio? This is from the audience. Are you familiar with Ray Dalio Bridgewater, where feedback is very public and very direct? Should we consider Compass's anonymous feedback model as opposed to Bridgewater's model? That is, it's agreed on principles, but different on implementation.
So I don't think so, and here's why. I believe that when the feedback is about me as Jordan, I should be aware of that feedback. And so if that feedback is going between my manager and HR, or my manager and my manager's manager, and it's about me, I believe in transparency there. I should be aware of what is being said about me, how am I being perceived, how am I being evaluated. When it comes to this developmental piece, though, the reason that I'm not for transparency is because the only person that it needs to be transparent to is me. So on a developmental perspective, my feeling is that the only person who needs to know about this is myself. When it's about me out there in the world, then I do believe in transparency. So again, I would say the underlying goal here is what would dictate when transparency is appropriate and when confidentiality is appropriate. But I absolutely agree that if there is an assessment of my performance out there in the world, that should be transparent to me and I should be aware of it. And to the extent that it should be shared elsewhere within the organization, I realize that there are probably both positives and challenges that emerge from that, but it's hard to argue with their success.
I think this has been it's a tremendous example of being on message and consistent with your articulated philosophy. This has been, ironically, it's been both focused and wide-ranging. Very interesting use of a tool, compass, to mix a metaphor as a lens to strike a balance and explore assessment, performance, development. Jordan, it's been terrific. I'm very, very grateful for your time and openness. Allison, do you want to wrap us up with final messages to the participants?
Happy to. Thank you both for a really interesting session. And I just wanted to let our participants know that over the next few days, you will be receiving a feedback survey via email. We really appreciate any thoughts and opinions you share with us there. And as a reminder, a recording of this program and the slides will be available within 3 to 4 business days. That's going to conclude the program. So thanks everyone for attending. Thank you to our presenters, Jordan and Michael, and to our sponsor, McKinsey & Company. We're actually publishing a report focused on the future of performance management with that partner in the coming weeks. So be on the lookout for that as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.